Now, as we're talking about Chloe, let's move on to her, and although she's a non-player character, her significance in this game is on a par with Max, and a driving force for most of the significant decisions made, whether it's her prompting them, or whether it's done, with the intent of saving her. As such, I would like to hesitate in even calling her a secondary character or a deuteragonist, but rather I would say she's a co-lead alongside Max, informing as much plot development, narrative trajectory and decision-making as her playable counterpart. It's worth noting, actually, that I haven't played or even looked at Before the Storm, which is the prequel game, so all of my comments regarding Chloe here are concerned with Life is Strange proper, and this prequel wasn't made by Don't Nod or written by Christian Devine, so I'm mildly suspect of how it handles these characters, and I'd be interested to know if anyone recommends it or not, as I'm not sure whether the narrative and the characters are faithful to what's established in this first game, so I am interested to know that. Anyway, Life is Strange is as much Chloe's story as it is Max's story, and in many ways, where Max's character arc is one of attaining a freedom from the trappings of personal internal insecurities, Chloe's story is a pursuit of freedom from external forces that have profoundly and tragically affected her from childhood. It's clear that she feels a certain sense of betrayal regarding her father's death, Max's move to Seattle, her mother's remarriage, and most recently the disappearance of Rachel Amber. And her idea of freedom is overtly an external one too, as she wishes to physically transplant herself from Arcadia Bay to Los Angeles in the hope of, liberation from this trauma. So, although both characters are pursuing this sort of self-liberation amidst the mysterious Arcadia Bay backdrop, it's prudent to note the thematic contrast between Max and Chloe too, as their defining and fundamentally opposing personalities are what craft, I think, such a chemistry between them and propel this story into, one that is, not simply good, it's actually awesome, and it contributes greatly to the appeal of this game, I think. So, where Max is from a comfortably middle-class and caring family, as evidenced by her parents' recurring text messages, Chloe has had relatively little comfort due to her aforementioned childhood trauma, which results in her hostility and her mistrust of authority, and generally results in her short temper and antagonistic behaviour. The game shows how radically Chloe has changed, by comparison, because we have these tangent universes wherein we see Chloe as a straight-A student, despite her being quite heavily disabled. And in the event that we go back to see the day her father dies, we see in her early teenage years that she's clearly a very happy-go-lucky child, prior to the events that lead up to William's death. So, compared to the Chloe of the proper timeline, we see someone who has adopted all the traits of rebellion, from tattoos to dyed hair to a punk rock demeanour to a rejection of traditional gender roles, stereotypes and sexuality, all of which is quite purposefully fluid and ambiguous within the character of Chloe. We also know that she uses recreational drugs, and this actually works narratively as well because it ties her in closer to secondary characters such as Frank and Nathan, and actually results in her being in that bathroom at the beginning of the game, which prompts the entire series of events and the butterfly effect to take place. Now, I think it's worth noting here that Chloe does divide some fans, and I've seen some people expressing a degree of contempt for her, actually, as much as praise. She's clearly very self-indulgent at times and selfish at times. Periodically, she scorns Max and reverts to complaining about her messed up childhood to justify her actions. And this me attitude and inability to listen to reason is clearly a result of her inability to process the loss that she suffered. I think it's important to consider it as a product of Chloe's grief rather than, a character flaw. Now, despite the contrasting traits of Chloe and Max, these two operate in a very intrinsic, symbiotic way. It's a classic odd couple dynamic we see in great comedies and dramas, not least Sherlock Holmes and Watson, who these two seem to haphazardly emulate at times. And they are exemplary of a pair who contrast in fundamental ways, while at the same time complementing and completing the personality of the other. Max and Chloe's rekindled friendship is the single defining relationship over the course of the game, I think, and as time goes on, we witness Max managing to measure Chloe's inflammatory reactions to things, and equally Chloe's forthrightness emboldens Max to become a more confrontational and confident person in her own right. That said, Chloe is extremely volatile and gung-ho, and I think she needs Max more than the other way round when it comes right down to it. Her reaction to Max's powers is instantly one of self-gratification and self-interest, citing that they can take over the world and hunt down Rachel, completely oblivious and without wider consideration to things like the rewind ability clearly causing Max nosebleeds. Chloe's character also has a very interesting relationship with guns. There's a narrative device known as Chekhov's gun, which, to paraphrase Chekhov, is something like, if a gun appears on stage in Act 1, then it must be used in Act 2, so as not to lead on the audience. And I think this is intrinsic to Chloe's appearances throughout Life is Strange, because almost always we have Chloe being the target or the handler of a gun from the outset of the game. And I had a real concern about her ability to stay alive and survive this game, as there's always a gun present around Chloe, and it's almost a perpetual foreshadowing to the concluding moments of the game's story and the decision you have to make there. Combined with moments such as Chloe almost dying when she gets stuck in the train tracks and then having the option to kind of euthanize her when she's paralyzed, Chloe seems to be a character that's perpetually tied to death, and arguably we could say her consistent misfortune is the universe trying to correct itself after Max messes with time, which I think actually is the premise of those Final Destination films, but I've never actually seen one. But anyway. It's also been speculated elsewhere that the 3 bullets on Chloe's necklace indicate the 3 instances where she can get shot in the game. The first being by Nathan, the second being by herself when you're in the junkyard, and finally by Jefferson. And I think this is an interesting indicator to her fated relationship with firearms, and just quite a cool theory in general. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I opted to save Chloe without hesitation due to the intrinsic coexistence I perceive between her and Max. The trolley problem is a great and somewhat harrowing conclusion for this game, and for Chloe. Her ending is either very traumatic, as an end to her life, or a bittersweet liberation from her devastated hometown. So Chloe is an inescapably tragic figure, which I think is evidenced in everything from her volatile personality to the details of her home, which I'm going to digress very slightly into now. If we look at the graffiti in Chloe's bedroom, we see a lot of anger, but we also see lots of details regarding how the past informs her present and how she's somewhat stagnated by being incapable of letting go of it. There's some old measurements on the wall which mark her height at different ages as she's growing up, which she's kind of scribbled over with profanity, but it's prudent to note that she didn't actually get rid of this remnant of her past or her father altogether. And also, more obviously, we have the exterior of the Price household, which in the linear timeline remains only partially painted blue, but in the alternative timeline where William lives, we see the painting of the house has been completed, indicating that, he fulfilled his task. But more importantly, I think this representation of the home is symbolic of how Chloe, and to a lesser extent Joyce, they've just stagnated, and time has basically stood still since William's passing, despite the best intentions of David Madsen